Formula One has lost an entire decade of pure racing. That's not some wild fan theory shouted from the grandstands. That's the two-time world champion Fernando Alonso dropping an emotional truth bomb just ahead of the Canadian Grand Prix. And when a man with that many Grand Prix starts, and that little patience for nonsense says the hybrid era robbed the sport of its soul, you listen. But here's the uncomfortable ripple effect nobody is talking about. If he's right, then everything we've been cheering for since 2014, every record, every championship battle, every overnight engineering miracle, has been built on a foundation that fundamentally weakened the very thing that makes motorsport intoxicating. The raw, risk-laced, human versus machine versus tarmac dance that used to leave us breathless. Today, we are going to tear apart Alonso's statement piece by piece, examine whether nostalgia is clouding his visor, and uncover a hidden irony inside the electric push that even the rule makers might not have anticipated. But before we even get to the data, there is one technical compromise baked into these power units that forces drivers into something so unnatural. It makes qualifying feel less like an all-out sprint and more like a desperate attempt to trick a battery into cooperating. And once you understand that strangeness, you'll never watch a modern onboard the same way again. Right? So let's rewind for a moment and give this whole hybrid conversation the context it desperately needs, because it's easy to forget just how radical the shift actually was. Back in 2013, Formula One cars were screaming V8 monsters, simple, loud, relatively light, and the only electric element was the KERS boost, a push-to-pass button that gave drivers an extra 80 horsepower for a few seconds per lap. It was a garnish, a little sprinkle of technology that added tactical spice without ever becoming the main course. Then 2014 arrived and everything went sideways in the most complicated way imaginable. The new power units were not engines with a battery strapped on. They were full-blown hybrid systems where the internal combustion engine and the electric motor were so intertwined that reliability immediately collapsed into a farce. According to reports from that season, teams were terrified just trying to finish races. Mercedes might have mastered the formula early, but everyone else was drowning in a sea of energy recovery software bugs, thermal management nightmares, and MGUH failures that cost millions and crushed morale. The negative consequence wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. The sport that was supposed to be the pinnacle of racing had become a mobile laboratory for road car electrification. And the drivers, the supposed gladiators, suddenly sounded like IT technicians on the radio, constantly managing settings and lifting off the throttle not to save tires, but to feed electrons back into a hungry battery. Alonso himself lived through that misery at Ferrari and then McLaren Honda, and honestly, anyone who witnessed the sheer agony of the McHonda years, where the power unit couldn't even complete a formation lap without going into limp mode, would understand why the man might be carrying some emotional scar tissue. But here is where I have to step in with my own human take, because I'm not a purist who thinks carburetors were the peak of civilization. I'm just a fan who loves racing. And I can admit that some of the engineering achievements of this hybrid era have been mind-blowing. These power units now exceed 50% thermal efficiency, a number that engineers a generation ago would have called impossible. They've broken lap records at nearly every circuit, and the way teams extract energy from heat and braking is genuinely fascinating. So if the numbers are so impressive, why does Alonso insist that pure racing died the moment the turbo-hybrid era began? That tension between statistical brilliance and emotional emptiness is exactly where this whole discussion gets messy. Let's follow the breadcrumb trail Alonso left in Montreal, because the man didn't just make a throwaway comment. He laid out a clear timeline of frustration that starts with the very philosophy behind the regulations. The thing that the world went or thought to go into the electrification, that was thought to be the future, and that doesn't apply to racing, he said, and that single sentence captures the entire contradiction. Road cars are moving toward electrification for sustainability, for efficiency, for cleaner city air, and all of that is noble. But a racing car is not a commuter vehicle. Racing, by its very nature, is about excess, about pushing beyond sensible limits, about making noise and fire and rubber smoke. And the moment you force a racing series to serve as a marketing tool for hybrid technology, you risk diluting that excess into something polite and compromised. Alonso then pointed to the current 50-50 split between combustion and electric power as the core problem, a dependency that means the driver is no longer the sole controller of the car's performance, because the battery's state of charge becomes a third, unpredictable teammate. I've driven some quick road cars, and I can't even imagine the mental gymnastics required to manage that at 200 miles per hour with someone's front wing threatening your diffuser. Sources claim that under the current regulations, the electric motor provides so much of the total output that, when the battery depletes at the end of a long straight, the car literally decelerates, a phenomenon called derating. And that deceleration creates a bizarre visual where a car that was just screaming toward a braking zone suddenly hits an invisible wall of reduced power. Fans watching at home might not always notice because the television cameras cut cleverly, but the data traces don't lie, and drivers have been complaining about it since the start of the 2026 season. Now, here's a mini cliffhanger for you. Imagine you're strapped into a qualifying lap, the session where a single thousandth of a second can mean the difference between pole and fifth, and you have to choose between starting the lap with a full battery but reduced turbo boost pressure, or full boost pressure but a battery that isn't completely topped up. That's not a hypothetical. That's the exact balancing act Oscar Piastri described when he explained why even a return to a 60-40 split might not fully fix the strangeness drivers feel on the straights. Piastri, who is one of the most refreshingly honest young drivers on the grid, said, "It's such a fine and difficult balancing act of having the battery in the right state because, yeah, either you start the lap with not a full battery or you start it with no boost pressure in the turbo, and there's not really a solution to that apart from changing the hardware." Read that again in your mind. The hardware itself forces a compromise before the lap even begins, meaning the very act of extracting maximum performance is now a negotiation with an energy budget rather than a simple foot-to-the-floor commitment. That, to me, is the smoking gun that gives Alonso's argument real weight. Pure racing, at least in the romantic sense, is supposed to be about pushing everything to the absolute limit. No caveats, no energy-saving modes, just bravery and engineering excellence colliding at the apex. When you introduce a scenario where a driver must actively lift and coast on a qualifying lap not to cool brakes, but to harvest energy, the soul of the competition has shifted in a way that many fans and drivers find deeply uncomfortable. But let's not pretend this is entirely a new problem born in 2026. The previous hybrid generation, which ran from 2014 to 2025, had its own version of this dependency. It just masked it better because the technology was different. Back then, the cars had that magical device called the MGUH, the motor generator unit heat, which recovered energy from the turbocharger's exhaust gases and fed it directly into the electrical system without draining the battery. That invisible helper meant the drivers rarely experienced the dramatic end-of-straight slowdown that plagues the current cars, and they could deploy electric power more consistently throughout a lap. However, that same MGUH was also astronomically expensive and so complex that it scared away potential new engine manufacturers, which is exactly why the 2026 regulations removed it entirely. The solution to one problem created another, and now we find ourselves in a strange limbo where the battery capacity is still huge. The electric motor is mightier than ever, but the tool that made the energy management bearable has been ripped out, leaving drivers to deal with the consequences on track. It's like Formula One decided to build a super-efficient hybrid house, then knocked out the load-bearing wall, and was surprised when the ceiling started sagging. The discussions now about moving to a 60-40 power split for 2027 or 2028 are essentially an admission that the 50-50 experiment didn't work from a sporting perspective. But as Alonso himself noted, that shift might still feel like a placeholder, a transition year before the next big technical reset in 2031, which raises the question of whether we're just limping through another half-decade of compromise. This is where the conversation about weight becomes impossible to ignore because adding an electric motor and a battery, the size of a small coffee table, inevitably makes the cars heavier, and heavier cars simply do not dance the way lighter ones do. Yes, safety regulations have also contributed to the bulk, the halo, the reinforced survival cell, the larger crash structures. All of those are non-negotiable and absolutely necessary. But the hybrid system alone is a significant mass penalty. Anyone who watched Formula One in the mid-2000s, the era of nimble, refueling-era rockets that changed direction like startled houseflies, will immediately feel the difference when watching today's cars lumber through slow corners. Alonso raced those machines, won his titles in them, and the muscle memory of that agility lives in his bones. Nostalgia is undeniably a factor here. I'm not above admitting that my own memory of screaming V10s makes the hair on my arm stand up. But nostalgia becomes a valid point of comparison when the current product consistently asks drivers to manage systems rather than simply attack the circuit. I'm not saying we should go back to unsafe death traps. Nobody wants that. But somewhere between a featherweight kart and a heavy hybrid luxury sedan, there is a sweet spot that rewards bravery and car control, and many drivers feel the current formula has drifted too far toward the sedan side. Let's look at an unexpected comparison that reinforces Alonso's argument while also making the whole situation even more ironic. Formula E, the all-electric series, was built from the ground up around battery power. And because that series has always known exactly what its limitations are, it designs circuits, race formats, and energy strategies that work within those boundaries. In Formula E, the drivers still manage energy, but the racing is structured so that the drop-off in performance doesn't create those jarring straight-line decelerations that plague Formula One. According to several sources within the paddock, the hybrid compromise in F1 is actually more difficult to get right than a pure electric formula, because you are constantly trying to blend two power sources that have fundamentally different delivery characteristics. That's like trying to duet with a partner who keeps changing the tempo, and the result is a driving experience that Piastri politely described as a little bit odd, which in driver speak probably translates to absolutely maddening. The fact that Formula E, a series often ridiculed by traditional motorsport fans, has somehow solved the energy deployment puzzle more elegantly than Formula One is a twist that makes Alonso's decade of lost racing claim seem less like bitter nostalgia and more like a harsh performance review. But not everyone in the paddock is ready to sign up for the Alonso doctrine of doom. Carlos Sainz, a driver who has experienced both the tail end of the previous hybrid era and the start of the current one, offered a more measured perspective that I personally found refreshing because it acknowledges the tension without completely dismissing the value of the technology. Sainz said he believes the 2025 power units, the last of the previous generation, had actually become a good endpoint, suggesting that they didn't harm the spectacle once the teams had mastered them. He drew a clear distinction between an electric system that acts as an add-on and one that acts as a dependency, and that single word, dependency, might be the most important term in this entire debate. KERS, the old push-to-pass system, was an add-on. It gave you a strategic weapon you could deploy to attack or defend, but you didn't need it to complete a lap. The current systems have crossed the line into dependency, where removing electrical power would make the car undrivable, and that changes the driver's relationship with the machine in a way that purists find offensive. Sainz even said that a 60-40 split probably still won't be enough for drivers, journalists, and purists, but at least it's something you can race with until real racing and real engines come back in 2030. That little phrase, real engines, slipped out almost casually, but it reveals a quiet hope shared by many that the future might correct what the present has overcomplicated. Let me pause here and give you my own slightly sarcastic but genuinely affectionate take, because I think we can love Formula One while still admitting that it sometimes acts like a brilliant inventor who refuses to read the instruction manual. The engineers who designed these power units are geniuses. No question. The thermal efficiency numbers I mentioned earlier are staggering, and the fact that a 1.6-liter V6 can produce enough combined power to lap a circuit faster than the fire-breathing V10s is a testament to human ingenuity. But somewhere along the way, the sport forgot that the driver's emotional experience matters just as much as the telemetry data. When Alonso says we lost a decade of pure racing, I don't think he's saying the racing was always boring. There have been incredible Grands Prix, stunning overtakes, championship finales that left us in tears. What he's saying is that the fundamental act of driving the car became diluted, that the raw, unmediated connection between right foot and rear tire was replaced with a kind of digital negotiation that rewards energy accountants as much as fearless warriors. And as someone who has spent way too many Sunday afternoons glued to a screen watching cars go around in circles, I can tell you the moments that stick in my memory are not the perfect battery management strategies. They're the wild, wheel-banging, smoke-pouring, borderline out-of-control saves that make you jump out of your chair. Those moments still happen, but they happen despite the regulations, not because of them. So, what happens next? The proposal to shift to a 60-40 combustion-to-electric power split by 2027 or 2028 is on the table, but sources claim the manufacturers are far from reaching an agreement because each power unit maker has built its architectural philosophy around the current rules, and a significant change could trigger a costly redesign that some teams are reluctant to fund. There's also the possibility that the change gets delayed until 2028, which would leave 2027 as another year of transitional limbo. Alonso, ever the impatient realist, has already called that scenario insufficient, and it's hard to argue with his logic that if you know the long-term fix is coming in 2031, why waste another half-decade dancing around an obvious problem? The sports decision-makers are now in a bind. Do they risk upsetting the manufacturers by forcing through a quicker revision, or do they protect the status quo and risk alienating the very drivers and fans who feel the racing has lost its edge? Behind closed doors, there is talk that the 2030 engine regulations might swing the pendulum back further toward combustion, perhaps with sustainable fuels playing the hero role, so that the environmental narrative remains intact without sacrificing the visceral thrill. Imagine a lightweight, high-revving internal combustion engine running on fully renewable fuel, augmented by just enough electric assistance to be efficient, but not enough to become a dependency. If that vision materializes, Alonso's lost decade might eventually be remembered as an awkward experimental phase that taught the sport a valuable lesson about balance. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, because the present still has its own strange mysteries to unravel. The Miami race earlier this season introduced a software modification that helped mitigate some of the derating issues by allowing more flexible energy deployment, and insiders say the difference was noticeable, but it was essentially a patch, a digital band-aid on a hardware wound. The fundamental limitation remains that the battery's energy density is not yet high enough to sustain full electric power for an entire qualifying lap without the car hitting a state-of-charge cliff. That cliff forces drivers to perform a delicate tap dance where they modulate the throttle with surgical precision, short shifting to keep the revs in a band that maximizes regeneration, and all the while they're watching a steering wheel display that looks more like a stock ticker than a racing instrument. The next time you see an onboard camera shot, pay attention to how often the driver glances down at that display. It's constant, and it's not because they're checking the time. Here's another layer that adds a bittersweet twist to Alonso's argument. The hybrid era actually forced drivers to become more complete athletes because the mental workload of managing these systems while maintaining maximum pace is astronomically high. The cognitive demands are so intense that sports psychologists and human performance coaches have become as essential as race engineers. In a strange way, the drivers of today might actually be more skilled than the drivers of the so-called pure racing era, because they're doing everything those legends did plus juggling a power management puzzle that would make a chess grandmaster sweat. So is it fair to say the racing is less pure? Perhaps, but it's certainly more complex, and complexity doesn't always translate to a better spectacle. A magic trick loses its wonder once you see all the hidden wires and trapdoors. And right now, the hybrid power unit is a magic trick where the audience is becoming increasingly aware of the wires. Let me toss in another mildly sarcastic observation, because I can't help myself. The same sport that introduced these incredibly complex hybrid systems to appeal to road-relevant technology then spent years trying to artificially spice up the racing with DRS, which is essentially a giant bandage that solves a problem the technology partly created. If the cars could follow each other closely without overheating tires and batteries, and if overtaking didn't require an energy deficit lottery, DRS might not need to exist. The push toward electrification, while commendable in its ambition, created a cascade of aerodynamic and energy-related side effects that the rule makers then had to counteract with gimmicks. Alonso, who has been around long enough to see every regulatory band-aid, probably sees this cycle and just feels tired. And honestly, when he says we lost a decade of pure racing, I think part of what he's mourning is the simplicity of a sport that didn't need so many asterisks. Now, I promised you a hidden irony inside the electric push, and here it is. While Formula One was busily chasing hybrid relevance to attract road car manufacturers, it accidentally built power units that are so specialized and so disconnected from any production car reality that the road relevance argument has become almost laughable. The 1.6-liter V6 with an MGUH that spins at over 100,000 RPM has nothing to do with your everyday hybrid sedan, and the new 2026 units, despite dropping the MGUH, still operate in engineering realms that are pure fantasy for the automotive industry. So the sport traded a decade of visceral racing for a marketing message that didn't even deliver the promised transfer of technology. That right there is the kind of irony that makes Alonso's frustration feel less like a grumpy old champion yelling at clouds, and more like a man pointing out that the emperor is not just naked, he's also forgotten his keys. Let's circle back to the human element because, ultimately, that's what we all tune in for. The sight of a driver wrestling an unwilling car through a high-speed corner, catching a slide with opposite lock, that moment of imperfection that proves a human is in control. These are the snapshots that built the legend of Formula One. When the car's electronics intervene so seamlessly that the driver's corrections are invisible, something is lost in translation. Piastri, again being wonderfully transparent, admitted that, until you find a split where full electrical power can be maintained everywhere, the driving experience will always feel a little odd. That word odd keeps popping up, and it's a polite way of saying that the car behaves in ways that contradict a driver's instincts. Instinct is sacred in racing. Destroy instinct, and you remove the very thing that separates the greats from the merely good. The good news, and yes, I do have some because I'm not entirely here to wallow in hybrid misery, is that the conversation is shifting. The fact that the sport is even discussing a return to a 60-40 split, and that there is a clear path toward 2030 regulations that could rebalance the combustion-electric relationship, suggests that the powers that be are listening. The hybrid technology itself is not the villain. As Sainz implied, when the electric motor acts as an add-on, a booster that enhances an already thrilling combustion core, it can create incredible moments of strategy and speed. The previous generation, at its peak, proved that. The problem arises when the electric tail wags the combustion dog, and that's precisely the phase we're in right now. My own view, for what it's worth, is that Alonso is both right and slightly unfair. He's right that the dependency on electric power has fundamentally altered the character of the cars and the demands placed on drivers, stripping away some of the raw purity that older fans and drivers cherish. He's slightly unfair because the decade he dismisses also produced legendary drives, championship battles that went down to the wire, and some of the most remarkable engineering stories in the history of the sport. But when you've tasted the pure, unfiltered adrenaline of a 2005 V10 at full cry, I can understand why everything else feels like a diluted substitute. So rather than picking a side, I'd rather just acknowledge that we're living through a messy, fascinating, and often frustrating transition. And the only thing worse than the growing pains of change would be a sport that stops questioning itself entirely. Before we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final microhook to chew on. The 2030 regulations are being shaped right now in meeting rooms where the battle between sustainability goals and sporting purity is already raging. Some proposals reportedly aim for a 70-30 split, massive reliance on sustainable fuels, and a dramatic weight reduction that could finally give drivers the agile cars they've been begging for. If that happens, Alonso's lost decade narrative might become the very thing that saved the sport from permanent dilution. The unanswered question is whether the manufacturers, who have invested billions in hybrid technology, will allow such a radical course correction, or whether they'll push for compromises that keep us stuck in an endless loop of energy management strangeness. The answer will define the next generation of Formula One. And knowing this sport's talent for dramatic unpredictability, I wouldn't dare predict which way it goes. All right, let's bring this ship into harbor. Fernando Alonso's claim that Formula One lost nearly a decade of pure racing is not a baseless outburst. It is a deeply personal but also technically defensible observation about how the balance between combustion and electric power has shifted the very nature of driving a Grand Prix car. The evidence from drivers like Oscar Piastri, the derating phenomenon, the qualifying compromises, and the weight increases all point toward a reality where the current hybrid dependency creates a racing experience that is fundamentally different from the simpler, more instinctive era Alonso remembers. However, the hybrid era has also been one of incredible engineering achievement and thrilling races, so the story is not one of total loss but of transformation. The future, with potential rule changes in 2027 or 2028 and a major reset in 2030, offers a glimmer of hope that the sport can find a balance where technology enhances the spectacle rather than undermining it. Until then, we're all just passengers in this high-speed experiment, and if nothing else, Alonso's refusal to stay quiet guarantees that the conversation keeps raging exactly as it should.